Steve Clemens, editor-at-large at The Atlantic, David Smith, the Washington bureau chief for The Guardian, the reporter who first reported excerpts from this book. And Seth Waxman is a former federal prosecutor. Seth, let me start with you. What do you make of this allegation that then candidate Trump knew about this meeting after it happened?
Well, I think that could be very key to the Mueller investigation. I mean, this is what we're talking about here is a conspiracy. And so Mueller has started at the low level, moved up to the middle, and now he's rising up to the higher level officials within the Trump administration, his son, his son-in-law. And if he's able to put criminal charges at their feet, you're getting very close to the top of the conspiracy. But even with that, a person has to have knowledge and an intent to participate in a conspiracy to be included in that conspiracy. So showing that Donald Trump Sr., the president, knew about those meetings, maybe took actions after those meetings would be very essential to the Mueller investigation to include him in that crime. In other words, just being a bystander to a criminal conspiracy does not make you a part of that conspiracy. So if in fact the president was made aware of that meeting, that if the participants met with him thereafter, and then additional what we would call in the law overt acts or things in furtherance of that conspiracy took place following those days, then you start to see a case that could rise up as high as the president himself.
How damning is it, Seth, how damning is it that a former White House aide thought that the statement that the president reportedly helped to draft on that Trump Tower meeting was possibly an obstruction of justice?
Well, you know, there's two parts to this case in total. There's the obstruction, the after the fact, and then there's the conspiracy before the election. And so I know the obstruction gets a lot of attention because we're seeing it happen in real time before our eyes. But if I was to pull back the curtain on the Mueller investigation, I bet what they're looking at is really, first and foremost, can they prove the underlying charge, the conspiracy, whether that's to hack computer databases, influence the election, all these post-election acts that could be considered obstruction. That's part of their investigation, but it's only, in my mind, a secondary part. I don't think Bob Mueller, if he were to bring a case, either present matters to Congress or bring an indictment himself, wants that indictment to look like a cover-up. I mean, people do get charged that. Infamously, Martha Stewart faced obstruction or lying to the FBI as the sole charge. She was never convicted of the underlying securities fraud, but they're spending a lot of time and effort on this investigation, obviously, and I think at the heart of it is the conspiracy before the election to influence that election.
Steve, I want to read another excerpt here. This is an excerpt from the book about Jeff Sessions, the Attorney General. On March 1st, when stories emerged that Jeff Sessions had met with Russian Ambassador Sergei Kislyak, Trump didn't see a problem. When the president was shown the story, he didn't see its significance. So what? He said. Steve Clemens, what's the most troubling part of all of this to you?
Well, the density of Donald Trump's relationships over time during the campaign, and apparently those people he had surrounded himself with perhaps the exception of Steve Bannon, with the density of those relationships with Russian figures was so astoundingly deep and dense that perhaps it just shows that the president had lost any sense of gravity, had lost any sense of boundaries with regard to this. And when it came to the way our government works and officials and the concerns that people had of undue influence by a foreign power, that just didn't register with Donald Trump. It may have been a very honest reaction from someone who'd just been knee-deep in Russian affairs for a long time. So that's very disconcerting. It's very interesting to see Steve Bannon now. I mean, what I think we haven't talked about is the real issue, beyond the legal issues, is the political one, because Steve Bannon has been a maestro of telling many GOP conservatives or GOPers that support Donald Trump what to think. And now a big chunk of that 30% is going to have to reconsider the whole notions of conspiracy, that this is all, you know, a Democratic game to entrap the president, and that Steve Bannon-style nationalism is both economic nationalism and real national security nationalism, which means Russia hugging has no place in that. And I think that is the impact here, that we may, for the first time, see a real budge in that 30% that has seemed immovable in supporting Donald Trump around the Russia investigation and around Steve Bannon's tutelage, that this is really different.
David, have you read the book in its entirety? Is that right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
I think you're the only one here who's read the book cover to cover.
Yes.
I want to, for our viewers and listeners right now, this is another excerpt. This is Michael Wolff's reporting on Michael Flynn. Michael Flynn shrugged off his dubious dealings with the Russians and others by saying this would only be a problem if the campaign won. And what were the chances of that? What was your overall impression reading this book?
My overall impression was one of dysfunction and discord, both in the Trump election campaign and especially in the White House now. It confirmed a lot of the suspicions we've had and reports we've read just about real sort of bitter factional infighting. Most obviously between Steve Bannon on the one hand and the so-called Javanka, Jared Kushner and Ivanka Trump on the other. There are some lurid accounts of screaming matches, of people bursting into tears, and a memorable quotation from Henry Kissinger, the former Secretary of State, saying this is a war between the Jews and the non-Jews in the White House. And some very uncomplimentary things said about the president himself, even by those who are close to him, friends, confidants, including Rupert Murdoch, who said something I won't repeat on air, and also calls him an idiot after one particular phone conversation about immigration policy and its contradictions.
David, what kind of picture, after reading this book, what kind of picture is being painted of our president?
A man not especially in control of events, a narcissist, an egotist, someone with authoritarian tendencies, and breaking a lot of the traditional rules of what it takes to be a president of the United States, and sometimes sort of watching things spiral out of control. That argument I mentioned where, there are expletives and shouts, Trump overheard it and apparently said, what's going on here? And was seemingly taken aback. And really he seems to just be relying on advisors, for several months, obviously Bannon himself, and others to sort of lead policy, lead appointments without any great expertise of his own. I mean, I think most people reading this book, should be worried and would be worried about who's actually sitting in the Oval Office.
Steve, really quickly here, there's another line in this book that's sure to get a lot of folks pretty angry. This is again, this is from Michael Wolff's new book. Quote, Trump conceived an early obsessive antipathy for Deputy Attorney General Sally Yates. She was, he deemed, such an expletive. This is from the president talking about then Deputy Attorney General Sally Yates. How are Republicans going to defend against that?
Well, now with what Bannon has done, which I think reorients the political map, it's going to be very hard for the Republican Party, the conventional leadership in the Republican Party, and others. Now, we've seen a lot of things, from the Roy Moore stuff, where maybe we're wrong on this. Maybe there's, a capacity among the leadership in the GOP just to roll over and just say all of this is just more of the same. But I really think Steve Bannon's comments change the game, because when you begin looking at that, people then begin saying, well, this isn't a conspiracy. What has Donald Trump said? He just took on the Deputy Attorney General who had warned him about Michael Flynn. Barack Obama had warned him about Michael Flynn. And that, I wouldn't call that antipathy, that repugnant, gross behavior and kind of commentary of the President of the United States versus someone who was celebrated and respected by both sides of the aisle in previous days. That is going to get a lot more scrutiny than it did a week ago. The map has now changed, and I think the willingness of at least some significant percentage of that 30% that has been rock solid behind Donald Trump is going to take a new look at this, and that's going to, I think, be consequential.
Steve, David, Seth, thanks to you.
Thank you.
Up next, more from this new bombshell of a book about the Trump campaign.